Well, to understand this conversation in studio, I'm joined by Melaku Desta. He's the coordinator, Africa Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
Right, just for an ordinary Kenyan to understand, what does the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement mean or entail?
The Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement means it's a tool, it is a set of commitments undertaken by our member states in order to dismantle the barriers, the trade barriers that impede the movement of goods and services across borders. Mm-hmm. It is Africa's tool to create a single market. It is Africa's tool to replace, as we often say, the small and fragmented markets that we all inherited from colonialism with a single large continental market.
Right.
That's how I describe it.
All right. Has there been any challenges so far?
Oh, yes, there have been, of course, there have been. We sometimes say, the AFCFTA was kind of unlucky because the agreement was adopted in 2018. It got very swift ratification by member states and it entered into force in May 2019. But barely 6 months later, the COVID pandemic struck, which meant that we were all forced into lockdown. While the AFCFTA was trying to expedite movement across borders, we were not even allowed to move out of our houses. So there have been challenges that are outside our control. There have been also challenges that under normal circumstances should be within our control. Governments take decisions, they adopt them, they sign, ratify, and everything. But when it comes to actually bringing the AFCFTA commitments down to the ground and changing their way of doing business, for example, not all of us are moving at the same pace. So there have been challenges, yes.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge, really. But now in terms of even successes, so far, have you or can you note any specific successes when it comes to this?
A lot. There is a lot of things that we can mention as successes. First, if you look at the agreement itself, 54 of the 55 Africa Union member states have signed it. 47 of them have ratified it. This has never happened before in Africa for the kind of agreement that it is, because this is a major economic agreement that aims to remove all the barriers and create that single market. So this is already a big achievement. Not only did they ratify, actual trade has started taking place between countries on preferential terms under what we call the Guided Trade Initiative, which is spearheaded by the AFCFTA Secretariat that's based in Accra, Ghana. So there is a lot that we can say about the successes, but of course that should not also mean that it's without its own challenges. There are challenges, but I am confident the challenge will be overcome and we'll be able to build on our successes so far.
Right. Let's talk about now the implementation of the AFCFTA, especially the strategies.
Yes.
So tell us about developed by who, what, and just give us details about the implementation strategies.
Developed by who would be a nice way to start. Developed by countries themselves, because we are talking here about national AFCFTA implementation strategies. When we say implementation, what exactly do we mean? We mean countries have undertaken, our governments have signed up to new commitments, new undertakings. And those are legally binding undertakings. So if governments are the ones who undertook those commitments, it's only governments who can implement those commitments. The question now is, the AFCFTA being so big, so ambitious, we couldn't leave it to chance. We had to, support our governments to take deliberate steps to make sure it's not just signed and ratified and kept in the law books. We wanted it to be part of the day-to-day operation of the civil service, for example, in every country, the customs office, the standards agency, and everything else. So the AFCFTA implementation strategies are first and foremost national strategies, written, formulated, adopted, launched, applied by national governments. But then, of course, our different governments have different levels of capacity, and development partners, international institutions such as ourselves at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations Development Programme, and others, they come in to support the development of those strategies. We have been at the UNECA, we have been leading this effort by and large. Together with the African Union Commission in 2019, we developed a set of guidelines on how governments can develop their own strategies. And in that process, we are there only to provide support. Otherwise, as I said, these are very important policy documents. And policy documents cannot be given to any government from outside. They have to be developed by themselves. Only then, only if they have them, if they own them, can they actually make a difference on the ground. That's what strategies are all about.
Right. I want us to talk about now the specificalities, for instance, the role that governments play. You've mentioned a couple of things when it comes to government, but what specific roles do governments play when it comes to this trade agreement?
It's a very good question, because you are right, we are talking about a trade agreement. And trade, in fact, as a matter of fact, happens, is carried out by private citizens, by companies, by individuals. So what is the role of government? I think is a very good question to ask. Here, the agreement requires every government to remove the prohibitions, the discriminatory taxes, etc., that apply on imports, for example. So what a government is required to do under these agreements is, one, they will have to remove any discriminatory legislation. For example, if there are two competing products on the Nairobi market, one is imported, the other one is domestically produced, the Kenyan government cannot impose higher taxes on the imported product and less taxes or no taxes on the domestically produced product. So this is a way of encouraging fair competition between imports and exports. If I'm trying to, as a businessman, if I'm trying to bring a particular product into the Kenyan market, the customs officer cannot impose above a certain amount of customs duties, for example. Or the customs officer cannot tell me, no, you cannot bring this into the Kenyan market, it's prohibited. Unless there are agreed reasons why it's prohibited, the customs officer, through the AFCFTA, is going to have new obligations that he or she has to comply with. So when we talk about government, we don't just mean the president and the parliament and everything else. We are talking about everybody, all the way down from the highest authorities to the ground where the trader, the businessman who is looking for a license to do business, for example, who wants to bring his products into the market, etc. All the people that this business person will meet representing government, they are part of government, and they will have new obligations to comply with as a result of this.
Right, very well explained actually. But away from the government, what about the private sector? Is it a bit different when it comes to the specificalities?
Very different, because here the government negotiates the agreement. Government adopts the agreement. Government is required to put in place, to carry out the necessary policy reforms, legislative reforms, regulatory reforms, and in some cases, institutional reforms to achieve exactly what I was describing earlier. Now, what is the government trying to do by becoming part of the AFCFTA? They are trying to encourage the business person to engage in profitable trade. In order to engage in profitable trade, the private sector themselves, the players, they have to know what it is. They have to understand what advantages it creates for them. If you are trying to trade goods between two neighboring countries, before the AFCFTA, maybe you're not allowed even to take the product across the border. Now that the AFCFTA is there, not only will you be allowed to take it across the border, you will be able to take it across the border at zero duty or at reduced duty. So what that means is, by virtue of the fact that you are not paying any additional taxes at the border, you are going to engage in more profitable business because of the AFCFTA. But in order to do all that, the private sector has to understand it. And that's a real challenge right now. Because the private sector, we talk to them all the time. The private sector, in many cases, they are not aware, which means both government and development partners such as ourselves, there is a lot that we need to do. Information dissemination is hugely important. And the kind of conversation that you and I are having right now, I see it as extremely valuable precisely because of that.
Yeah, I mean, that awareness is very critical. But let's talk about the ordinary African who's, for instance, watching this conversation right now and is wondering, for me specifically, how will this benefit me? Maybe if you can also put that down in point form.
For the ordinary African, we can say it benefits us in a lot of ways. it will take time. It's not something that happens overnight. But otherwise, imagine a trained doctor, a trained teacher, a trained expert in a particular area. All of a sudden, because of the AFCFTA, these experts will be able to sell their skills to a continent of 1.4 billion people with a spending capacity of close to $3 trillion US. Right. Think about that. If I'm providing a service, I'm a doctor based in Nairobi, but I'm such a famous doctor. Everybody wants to come to me. Then the Kenyan government is not going to stop the patients from coming into this country and receiving my service. Right. The government of Ethiopia or Nigeria is not going to stop me from going into those countries and providing my services to the patients over there. So gradually, when we talk about creating a single market, what we mean is, both the individuals as experts, as service providers, but also the individuals as service consumers, as consumers of ordinary products. More competition means better things for the consumer. Right. More competition means enhanced quality of products and services. More competition typically means better prices for the same quality product. So for the ordinary African, I think it is also an opportunity for us to think beyond our borders, to think like Africans, to look at the AFCFTA as a tool with which we can realize our centuries-old dream of Pan-Africanism, where others will not be benefiting at our expense by dividing us, but we can be together, talk to each other, and come up with policies and positions that can serve Africa rather than Africa's adversaries. That's how I would look at it.
Right. Let's talk about the African Trade Policy Center. It has been there for a while, and it actually sits within the UN Economic Commission for Africa. What is it about? Is it an independent entity, quite different from what we have?
That's a very good question. The African Trade Policy Center is a unit within the UN Economic Commission for Africa. It has been there for just over 20 years. It was established in 2003. It was established with support the partnership between the government of Canada and the UNECA, because we saw at the time that Africa was being pulled in different directions. The World Trade Organization rules, were very unfavorable for Africa. New negotiations were launched in 2001. Africans had to come up with new policies, new positions, and everything else. So the UNECA at the time needed to respond to that, because the ECA there as a think tank for Africa to support Africa's socio-economic development, they saw trade policy as a big challenge. So they realized that they could not respond to this challenge kind of business as usual. They had to create something new. So it was because of that out of a partnership between the UNECA and the government of Canada, the Africa Trade Policy Center was created. It is part of the UNECA for all practical purposes, but of course it also has some programs. It also, it works in accordance entirely with the UNECA rules. The UN rules, part of the United Nations, but it has a very dedicated focus on supporting Africa's trade policy, bilaterally, regionally, continentally, as well as Africa's relationship with the rest of the world in terms of the multilateral system in the WTO, plus Africa's bilateral relations with the US, the EU, China, all of the other major players in the world. So that's what African trade policy does.
What should Africans expect from this AFCFTA? Of course, it has a very big vision. So are we hoping that it will transform Africa in terms of the economy?
Absolutely. The AFCFTA, we describe it in very lofty, high-sounding terms, with very good reasons. At the UNECA, we have done the economic analysis, the modeling work, to estimate the impact that the AFCFTA can have on Africa from different directions. And our projections show that with the AFCFTA implemented, intra-Africa trade can increase significantly. In other words, instead of just importing products from outside and then being dependent on others, we can actually strengthen our trade relationship so that we can be progressively more self-sufficient as Africans. So intra-Africa trade within Africa, between different African countries, can be transformed significantly. Not only that, because we are trying to create this one single market without internal barriers within the continent, we expect the AFCFTA to lead to a situation where large-scale investment can easily find justification, because you are not coming to Kenya to invest and then serve a certain million people. You are coming to Kenya to invest and reach 1.4 billion people. So that way, it is also a tool to attract investment. It's a tool to attract large-scale investment, for example, in manufacturing, so that once you produce something within Africa, you will have access to this huge market. So it is going to be a transformational instrument. But, and I can't go on and on like that, but that's dependent on one important thing, implementation. Implementation. Without implementation, the mere fact that we have an agreement is not going to make any difference at all. The agreement is as good as the implementation of that. It's implementation. Without implementation, nothing is going to happen. That's why everybody is concentrating on that next step, supporting implementation. That's what brought us to Kenya to organize this conference that you started with earlier.
Yeah, yes. That's actually what I want us to wrap up this conversation with. Maybe you can tell us a bit more on the conference that's happening here in Nairobi with regards to the implementation strategies for AFCFTA.
We organized a conference here in Nairobi. Kenya, Nairobi is one of those cities in the continent where we often come to organize these kinds of events. So we brought the continent to Africa right now, just this past, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. What are we doing here? With the support of the ECA, the UNDP, the GIZ, and other partners, something like 45 countries, African countries, now have their own national AFCFTA implementation strategies. In some cases, even our regional economic communities have got regional AFCFTA implementation strategies. The East African Community is one of them. IGAD is another. ECOWAS is another. It goes on. So why did we come here? Because we wanted to create a platform. We called it a peer learning conference. We wanted to create a platform in which the countries, the governments that developed these strategies with our support, that are trying to implement these strategies, can talk to each other and say, what is working with you? What's not working with you? What is it that I can learn from you? What is it that you can learn from me? We wanted to have that kind of horizontal conversation amongst African states. And it is going fantastically well.
Definitely. It sounds very practical, actually.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much. This has been an interesting conversation. That's all the time we have. We have been having in studio Melaku Desta. He is the coordinator for Africa Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. We were talking about the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. Thank you so much for that. It has been an interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's a wrap for Africa Speaks. Thank you for watching. My name is Fathia Mohammed Noor. Business Today is coming up next.